Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Ethics in Publishing Conference. We just had a great conversation on anti-racism in publishing. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague at the College of Professional Studies, Dr. Elizabeth Rule. Elizabeth is the director of the AT&T Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy, academic director of the Semester in Washington Politics program, and faculty in residence at the George Washington University. Her work has been published in American Quarterly and the American Indian Culture and Research Journal, and her research, including the Guide to Indigenous DC mobile application, which she's going to discuss today, has been featured in the Washington Post, Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien, The Atlantic, and NPR. Her book manuscript, Reproducing Resistance, Gendered Violence, and Indigenous Nationhood, explores the intersection of Native American First Nations women's reproductive justice issues, gendered violence, and the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Rule has received support from HOLISO, the Center for the Study of Chickasaw History and Culture, the American Indian College Fund, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Before coming to Washington, D.C., she was visiting scholar in anthropology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a Ford Foundation dissertation fellow. Rule received her PhD and MA in American Studies from Brown University and her BA from Yale University. She is an enrolled citizen of the unconquered and unconquerable Chickasaw Nation. It's my great pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Rule.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction and for the invitation to be here to present at this very exciting conference and part of this very engaging program. Thank you all also for joining to learn more about this subject. I really look forward to a wonderful Q&A session as well. So please speak up. I'm happy to answer any and all questions. So today I'm going to be speaking about the Guide to Indigenous DC, which is a mobile application that I created and launched in July of 2019. The Guide to Indigenous DC is a completely free and publicly accessible iOS mobile application, meaning that all of you can download it for free right now if you have an iPhone. It's available in the App Store and it appears just like this. You can see it on my own home screen. And once you open up the Guide to Indigenous DC, you'll come to this screen. So what I really want to speak about today is the way that I created the Guide to Indigenous DC, future plans, and also research methods that I use to publish this digital work. This was the first project of this type that I had ever created. And so it was a real learning process for me, but also one that was very rewarding. So within the app itself, once you open it, you'll see that there's the opportunity to actually click on the Guide to Indigenous DC. That's because right now the app is set up to actually incorporate additional tours as well. I'm going to be speaking about that a little bit more toward the end of my presentation, but just know for now that there are lots of additional tours and digital maps coming. So really, the Guide to Indigenous DC is a decolonial digital mapping project that combines iOS mobile application technologies and traditional Indigenous knowledge to really map and demonstrate the ongoing presence of Indigenous peoples in the Washington, D.C. area. I actually created this project because I'm a professor at GW and I work with a lot of Native students on campus. In particular, I run and administer and teach for the Native American Political Leadership Program, which brings Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian students to DC for a semester in Washington. They learn about the federal tribal trust relationship, and they really gain skills to be able to go back to their own Indigenous communities to serve as ambassadors. As tribal nations, we interact with the federal government on a nation-to-nation basis. And so creating those bridges between a place like the nation's capital and all of the, national advocacy organizations and federal offices with, tribal nations and Native communities spread out throughout the entire country, it's really important to develop those relationships, and that's what the program seeks to do. But while I was interacting with these students, I often heard that they felt sort of out of place in DC, right? There weren't lots of representations of Native people here. Many of these students felt homesick and even sometimes, offended by things like the Washington football team mascot that, is plastered all around the city. So I created the Guide to Indigenous DC because me, myself being a Native person, I had also had that experience of coming here and having to find and create and learn about Native peoples in this city. The way that I came to curate what I call these sites of Indigenous importance was through my own relationship with that community. Talking to other, members of the Native community who say, have you seen this thing over here? Or have you visited this site? And so really I curated this communal knowledge and combined that with historical research and also oral histories and community development relationships with the Piscataway people who call Washington, D.C. their traditional ancestral homelands to create this map. And as you'll see here, the map really spreads out across the entire city. And the purpose there is to demonstrate, the breadth of Indigenous presence in DC. We weren't confined as Native peoples to one area or one neighborhood, right? DC is all Indian land. And so the sites themselves are laid out here, and you'll see that we have a mix of both historical and contemporary sites. Some of my favorites include, the U.S. Marine Corps War Memorial. That was incorporated as a way to show the millions of tourists who visit DC each year, that these iconic sites of our national history and national identity also incorporate Native people, right? So one of those service members that's hoisting the flag in that statue was actually a tribal member, Ira Hayes. Moving on from there, we have sites like Theodore Roosevelt Island, right? And this was a land base where Native peoples who were actually being pushed out of DC by the creation of the city sought refuge, right? They established their own communities on this island to sort of protect themselves and, move away from ongoing urban creations. Moving on, we have sites like the Indigenous Peoples March, which is a more contemporary and recent, site that is a point of Indigenous activism. And so really through all of these, what you're hopefully seeing is that there's a combination of, historical, contemporary, artistic, cultural, monumental type sites that really challenge this idea that Native people can be put in any type of box or relegated to any type of particular sphere, right? We are all throughout DC. DC is the ancestral Indigenous homelands of one group of people, and also the contemporary home of so many tribal people who have come from all across the country. And I apologize if there is some background noise. It's raining, and so what you hear is maybe the raindrops. So I apologize for that. It was very important to me when I was creating the Guide to Indigenous DC to incorporate as many accessibility features as possible. And that's some of what you see here. So we have a text-to-speech feature, which increases accessibility, as well as a virtual tour mode. That's one of the things that people, most often don't realize is a great tool in the guide. So what that means is that for users in DC, you can actually geolocate yourself in relationship to these 17 sites. So you can set it to either look at an individual site that you're next to, or actually complete a walking or driving or metro tour. But even if you're not in DC, you can use the app. Through the virtual tour mode, you can take basically a walking tour through the map at various speeds. And you're actually able to also use virtual on-the-ground 360-degree imaging to see those sites just as if you were standing there. We also have some really important links, of course, to the larger center that I direct, and also the ability to link up to your own social media sites. This was another important feature for me when I was thinking about what I wanted to actually achieve in publishing this piece. And that was the creation of community and a larger digital footprint to really spur conversations about these topics, confronting Native invisibility, educating people about Native sites in DC. And so what you see here are some examples of what that looks like if you were to share on social media platforms. We have pre-populated hashtags, and users have the ability to share either the entire guide, right, the entire app, or just individual sites. This is important too, because especially in places like Twitter, you can create a hashtag environment that shows a history of digital engagement, and where users can again connect with folks that they either want to share this information with, right, in their own circles, or connect with strangers who have also this demonstrated interest. Users again can use the map in different ways with different visual components. You can zoom in, to a real intense street view, or zoom way out to get that larger landscape. And I thought it was exciting to share one particular site that's incorporated in the map, which is the mural of Piscataway history and culture. This is a piece that we actually have on GW's campus. This was a mural that was installed by an artist who worked in close collaboration with members of the Piscataway community, and installed, really a graffiti style mural that speaks to DC as those traditional ancestral lands of the Piscataway people. And here you see also another nod to Indigenous activism. This image to the right of the actual graffiti part is a replication of an activist poster for The Longest Walk, which is a movement in the 1970s for Native rights. In each site, you then have a description that I wrote. Again, this was a process of oral histories, interviews with folks like the artist, interpretation, and archival work, as well as, you'll see the links to external resources there. From a user perspective, when you complete the tour or exit out, you get an evaluative message from us thanking you and asking to give a simple thumbs up or thumbs down. This is the best way to engage folks, as I've learned as I enter this new area of app creation. It's hard to do something like a full survey, but in the Facebook age, we're all very familiar with the simple thumbs up, like, and I'm happy to say that we have a like to dislike ratio of 37-1. And that is with the app being downloaded almost 2,500 times, with more than 2,300 complete tours completed. Again, we have a mailing list where folks can sign up to stay engaged with myself, the center, and additional developments in the app. On the backside, it's been really interesting to see how this digital publication has been circulated amongst users. This is just an example of the types of graphs that I'm able to generate, looking at things like particular site views and site visit links, right? That way I'm able to see what sites are most popular, where are people spending the most time, where are folks starting their tours and finishing them. So, you know, the guide itself is the entire length of DC, right? So most people only complete a portion if they're doing it in person. I also am able to generate statistics about users who engage the app in a virtual versus physical capacity, and also see just a heat map of where those sites are visited. I have a number of plans for expansion in the works. One of those areas includes incorporating additional multimedia components. I really want to be able to incorporate native language and oral histories into the sites. Right now, if you see some of the sites, particularly the more contemporary ones, you'll see that I have embedded videos already that are maybe news coverage of a particular event. I know that that's the case with some of the activist sites, as well as some of the artistic sites. But beyond the multimedia components, I also plan to add new tours. So I'm currently working to create a guide to Indigenous Baltimore right up the street in collaboration with a Baltimore, Native community member. I'm also creating a tour on a national scale. That's going to be the guide to tribal colleges and universities. That's going to use this same platform as a way to speak about the tribal colleges and universities movement, which was a push for Native education, as well as a resource now for Indigenous students who are looking to enter higher education. And there are a couple of others that I'm working on right now with additional partners, just to give you a sense. So I'm happy to take any and all questions that you have. I know this was a lot of information in a short amount of time, but I want to make sure to set aside as much time as possible to answer any and all questions.
So thank you so much, Dr. Rule. I have myself downloaded this app and used it, and I really encourage everybody to do so. It's so impressive. When I first found out about this app, I knew we had to have you at this conference, because for me, it's the perfect intersection between publishing and technology, with diversity and accessibility. And myself, I've always been really interested in Native culture as well. Can you talk a little bit about some of the background research that went into this specifically? I know you've done a lot of research on Native American culture and history, but specifically for the app, what were some of the sources that you used? And you already talked about interviews and things, but
yeah, absolutely. So the actual research process was really interesting. Really, the entire creation of this app has been pretty interesting from my perspective. I should say that this was a project that in so many ways just fell into my lap. My research area is really primarily on violence against Native women in the US and Canada, and particularly how the missing and murdered Indigenous women's issue intersects with reproductive justice. So something like, Native history in DC, and especially something like mobile application technology creation was a new field for me. But it was important for me to follow that path as a Native person living in this area, and as a Native educator who was working with Indigenous students who were having, like I expressed earlier, these feelings of in some ways dissatisfaction with the city and Native representations and knowledge and recognition here. So in many ways, it was a learning process for me as well from the ground up. So one of the main ways that I went about my research was just by speaking to people. So this happened in collaboration with folks that I just met through various events in the Native community who, again, were welcoming me to DC and telling me, oh, I should go here, I should go there. And so I just kind of naturally learned about these various places. And I should also say that right now there are 17 sites, but that is absolutely not exhaustive. There are many more. And just like I hope to set out with the visual that the map offers, really all of DC is Native land and has importance to Native people in one way or another. So these are 17 that are just sort of what I would call the highlights. But it's been a very interesting process in the sense that once I published it in July of 2019, a lot of folks in DC also reached out to me and said, have you seen this placard over here? Have you seen this piece over here? And so on and so on. So in that way, a lot of the research process was really, kind of community engaged curation. And then when I was actually writing the descriptions of sites, I worked with, like I said, Piscataway community members. There are a number of researchers who are doing really interesting work and who do focus their research on the history of Native peoples in Washington, D.C. So I was able to connect with some of those scholars and learn from them and the archival research that they have done. And then, it's really just an ongoing process. And especially as I branch out into additional types of tours, the type of content is going to change. So right now, just to give folks an idea, I'm in conversation with a Native artist who wants to do sort of a performative art piece and translate that into, a digital map. So, obviously that has a very different type of methodology that I would employ there. So, it's been a very exciting and dynamic project in that way.
That's great. So we do have several questions from the audience, and there are a couple audience members that are asking if it's going to be available on Android in the future, and also why did you decide on iOS and not also Android? Yeah, that's feedback that I've received since day one of the launch. Even before I launched and was talking about creating it, there was always this conversation around creating an Android version. That is absolutely in the works, and I plan to launch the Android version in the next 3 to 6 months, I would say. So it is coming. So for all you Android users out there, please, keep an eye out and follow, me and the Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy on social media so that you're able to stay updated when that app does launch. The way that I came to launching the iOS version first was actually through a little bit of polling that I did, asking folks, what their primary, phone usage was. And the answer was, the iPhone, the Apple platform. And so I went for that just based on a short survey poll that I conducted. But yes, absolutely. The reason that the Android version doesn't exist at this point in time is simply a matter of funding. So far, the Guide to Indigenous DC has been funded entirely by grant support. So I've worked with the American Indian College Fund, Natives in Philanthropy, the Minneapolis Foundation, and just in September, I became an MIT Solve Indigenous Communities Fellow that's also, supporting the expansion of the app through different platforms and different partnerships that will yield more maps and apps and guides. So yes, the Android version is coming. Thank you. That's great. Yeah, and it's my understanding also that the iOS platform is just easier to submit to, and you don't have to worry about, there's various, Android devices, so it's a lot more complicated. And just to remind people, Dr. Elizabeth Rule mentioned that there's heavy rain in DC, so the noise you hear in the background is rain and wind, not somebody typing. Let's see. So another person asked if location tracking can be turned off in the app. You mentioned, that the location tracking can be on. I guess it can be turned off, right?
Yes, absolutely. So users can access the app just site by site. From that homepage, they can navigate to, whatever sites are of interest to them and engage all of the materials there. It's the walking tour component or driving tour component where someone opts in to be geolocated that draws on the same technologies basically that Google Maps uses to guide you to and from different locations. So yes, you do not have to use that feature. It's really just if you want to use the app to find what's close to you or to actually complete all or part of the tour. Even if you're in DC, you can also use the virtual tour mode to go from site to site without ever moving yourself.
Thank you. So, one difference between an app like this or other electronic products compared to the traditional scholarly monograph that I know you're also working on from our conversations is, generally speaking, once you finish and publish a book, you don't have to worry about updating it too much, although that does happen sometimes. But, a big challenge with this is, the technology is changing and you want to add more things. So can you talk a little bit about, has this been, challenging? Has it been frustrating? Has it been exciting? What's working on this app it's never really finished?
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I should say that I am working to also turn the Guide to Indigenous DC into a monograph as well. So that's actually been a separate sort of project that has been much more aligned with, the type of traditional research and writing that I've been doing for the last several years. And so that's been exciting too, because I'm able to dive even deeper into each of these sites. Still, the monograph will be public facing, I should say. But yes, it's been, I would say, very exciting that this is an ongoing project. It is rather labor intensive, again, because I get submissions from community members all the time about additional sites to incorporate. But that's, part of the importance of, I think, what this project is trying to achieve. The fact that there are so many of these places that signify, how DC is the home of Native people and the site of Native advocacy is exactly the point, right? And so as much information as I can gather and, curate in a way that the public can access, the better. As I expand to additional communities and additional focus areas within this map, digital map platform, that's also been very exciting. There are really unlimited opportunities I'm finding for expansion. And so really one of the things I'm dealing with as, the author of this digital publication is just how to manage, priorities and so on. So right now I'm generating about 1 to 2 maps a year. The guide to tribal colleges and universities is much larger, right? It's national in scale and scope, and it also includes 39 sites as opposed to 17. So that's been a little bit more labor intensive, but that is set to launch in January of 2021. And then, like I said, I'm already working on the Guide to Indigenous Baltimore. And so, yeah, I would say that it's exciting, it's engaging. It aligns well with the work that I try to do with the AT&T Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy, which is to create, resources and tools that are useful to the Native community. So this is, going to be culturally relevant to Indigenous users. It's going to serve that purpose of confronting Indigenous invisibility and advancing things like decolonial mapping. But it's also of great use to non-Native audiences. People can access the Guide to Indigenous DC with no background knowledge and come out with, a pretty solid understanding of, these Indigenous sites in the nation's capital. And how that interacts with our national narrative about relegating Indigenous peoples to the past, hiding them, confronting and challenging our authenticity as Indigenous people is really the purpose there. So I should say, this is also being incorporated into K through 12 education. It's in the curriculum of 2 universities right now. And so I find it very exciting that the work is never over here.
Yeah, I think it's exciting too. And I know we've talked about you turning this into a book, and I really look forward to that. I mean, books definitely have their place, although I love using the app. And I have to say personally, like when I look at all the things that you do, the different things, I'm just amazed. It's just like, I feel very underaccomplished at my age. So we have another great question from the audience. Were you limited in adding attractions and features for your app by the chosen development toolkit, or were you able to include everything you wanted? And do you anticipate any issues with your Android version?
Yeah, that's a really good question. No, I have not felt limited. Right now, there are multiple components. So there's the app as a whole, and then there's the map as a whole. And then within that, of course, each site has its, description. That's going to be expanded in the book form. And so I'll be able to link, I anticipate, each site to potentially the book chapter if someone wants to learn more. And there are also existing external links within the app right now for folks who want deeper engagement than the brief description that I provide. There's a photo gallery, right? And so there are multiple photos of each site. And those photos don't only include images of the physical site itself. They also include archival images of, the event, the action, the individual, to really create, a full context for where this place is and why it's important. And then, like I said, I also have the ability to incorporate multimedia in the form of video or audio components. So that's very exciting as well. One of the areas for expansion I have not yet tapped into that I will shortly is incorporating something like a marketplace in order to promote Native-run businesses and events. This will be particularly important when I create apps in partnership with tribal nations that are really using this as a tool and a platform for cultural heritage preservation or economic development. Being able to direct folks to, restaurants, stores, community events beyond the app and beyond the map itself is another thing that I have just not done yet, but it is on the horizon.
That would be great. Yeah. I guess there would be some good advertising opportunities with that as well. Revenue, we have to now and then think about revenue as well, You mentioned, I mean, you mentioned funding as a part of this, and I can imagine that having different sources of funding would be important. So this, I know this has gotten a lot of media attention. You mentioned that it's been added to curriculums, and I really look forward to seeing it continue. Earlier, this is kind of a side topic, but earlier you mentioned the Redskins, the Washington Redskins moniker, which I hate. And finally, just recently, there was an announcement about that they are kind of reconsidering it because I believe it was FedEx threatened to abandon their sponsorship of the team and the stadium. So, any comments about that? And is that going to be incorporated into the app as well someday?
Definitely. That's a really important topic, especially when we think about, the histories of settler colonialism and the way in which the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., has operated as the seat of power for, a settler colonial government, right? And that really, again, goes back to the fundamental mission of the Guide to Indigenous DC is to disrupt this idea that, the capital is a place where Native people are not. Again, that just narrative of erasure, that Native people, aren't engaged with national politics, an erasure of Native people's, again, nation to nation, government to government relationship with the United States. And so the way that the Washington team plays into that is just, deeply ironic that we have, this very demeaning name that is a dictionary defined racial slur as something that people in DC really rally around when they, want to participate in something like, football or, city pride around their sports teams, which I think is fine. The issue is simply the name, right? It's not really a question or a controversy about whether or not it is offensive. It definitely is. There's been a lot of scholarship about the history of that term. And so, again, when I have Native students coming to this place and seeing, that term being, just plastered all around in advertising and so on, and sports fans rocking that, that is a concrete dehumanization of Native people that's happening in DC. So I'm very happy to hear that there are increasing conversations about changing that name. And it, again, just speaks to the entire purpose and goals of something like the app, is confronting, misinformation of Native people, confronting these stereotypes of Native people, confronting, ongoing use of racist language to talk about Native people, right? Native people are here. Native people are modern people. We're alive. We are, amongst and interspersed into the public. And that's what the app seeks to create. So I think that supports, getting rid of a name that upholds this very bad legacy of oppression and violence and ongoing discrimination.
Well, Dr. Rill, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I really look forward to seeing new versions, the new guides that you're working on and your forthcoming books and everything. And I'm really proud to work with you as a colleague. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you again for having me. It's been my pleasure to speak with you all. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the wonderful program that's been put together. Very exciting. Thank you.
Thank you. So next we're going to be hearing from one of the publishing alumni about open educational resources at 3 p.m. And then at After that, at 3:30 p.m., we'll hear from Bill Gasdorf about accessibility in publishing. Thanks again, Dr. Rule.